All right, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. So yeah, I did my PhD work at the University of Kentucky. Started in about 2016. As I also did my undergrad at UK, and I worked in several different entomology labs at UK. And be sure to support them. They are a top 10 program in the US for entomology. Um, and then I got into this position in Dan Potter's lab. Some of you might be familiar with some of his work. He's been a staple there in the entomology department for about 45 years. And so when I started, we had gotten a grant from the university or the US Golf Association, and we were tasked with figuring out how to incorporate monarch butterfly habitat onto golf courses. As we're discussing with Helen just a few minutes ago, there are a lot of challenges with creating habitat from seed, especially for milkweeds, because of their slow germination rate, and especially when they're in seed mixes. So we quickly moved away from that project and got into this more interesting question of how we can use the ecology of the monarch butterfly to our advantage when creating conservation plantings. So now I'm currently a technical advisor for the Davy Tree Expert Company, and they hired me on because they are wanting to expand their pollinator profile. Some of the things we're looking to get into is offering pollinator habitat establishment and monarch way station establishment for residential communities, as well as transitioning right-of-way habitats, things like gas lines and power lines, into pollinator habitats so they can increase that biodiversity and get a little more play and a little more ecological function out of those areas. But today we're going to be talking about mainly the work I did while I was here in Kentucky, looking at optimizing the conservation value of urban gardens and monarch way stations. So when I first got this monarch butterfly project, I started thinking, what the heck good is a monarch butterfly anyways? People are absolutely nuts about these things. And I started thinking, what is it that draws us to the monarch butterfly? And first I thought, well, maybe it's because it's just a great pollinator. But when you really start thinking about it, it's kind of got this really skinny mouth part that very discreetly sneaks into flowers. You can only see 4 legs on this guy here. He's actually got 2 of her legs tucked up into the thorax, which she uses as these very sensitive tongue-like structures that she uses to taste the milkweed. And we start comparing that to things like honeybees or bumblebees. There's really no comparison. Basically, these little bees are essentially pollinating machines. They've got all sorts of different adaptations that make them great for pollinating flowers. They've got these little hooked hairs that grab onto pollen. They've got these pollen baskets on their back leg. So maybe this whole pollination issue isn't the reason why we're so crazy about monarchs. Well, maybe it has something to do with just them being a beautiful and charismatic butterfly. Well, certainly they are, but if you visit the Lexington Arboretum, there are plenty of other charismatic and beautiful butterflies that you may encounter. So that must not be it. And they don't taste good. We're not supporting all sorts of urban bird populations. We're not eating the monarch butterfly. It's not really providing tons of food for us either. So what is it about the monarch butterfly that makes it so special, and why are we so interested in conserving it? Well, and why do we value it in such a high dollar value? There's just so many people involved with monarch conservation. There's so much money being invested in this area. And we're valuing the monarch butterfly with the same sort of numbers that we value things like bald eagles and polar bears and whales. And this is just completely unprecedented and unheard of for an invertebrate species to attract this much attention. I think a lot of it has to do with their just exciting and unique life history and their story. This annual they take every year captures our imagination. Some of these little insects with a 4-inch wingspan are flying upwards of 2,000 miles to complete this journey. They'll start off sometime in about March at the overwintering grounds.
Did everybody else lose connection too? Okay.
Yes.
Adam, we
We'll
can't.
move.
Oh, there you are. Sorry, we
Good?
lost. Yeah, we lost connection to you for just a minute.
Okay. So the monarchs, they wake up in March. They'll make their way to the southern US, at which time they break out of their reproductive diapause. They'll start to deposit their eggs, and then that entire population will die off. From there on out, successive generations will sort of leapfrog their way throughout the United States, making their way up into as far north as southern Canada. At some point, all of the environmental cues align: the temperature, the photo period, the quality of the host plants they have available, and that will kick that last generation back into reproductive diapause, and then those butterflies will make their way all the way back to the overwintering grounds. What's unique also about the monarch butterfly and our love for it is that there's just this long-standing history of citizen science in the monarch butterfly. A lot of what we know about the monarch butterfly started off with volunteers helping to figure these things out. Here we see a citizen scientist on the cover of National Geographic in August 1976, and she's at one of the overwintering sites. And without the help of volunteers like her and others, we probably would have still be looking for some of these sites. These are all going to be in the highlands of Mexico in these unique habitats. So each year, the butterflies will congregate by the hundreds of thousands in these areas. They'll actually cover the trees from head to toe. These are these Omel fir forest trees in the highlands of Mexico, and they return to the same sites every year. And monarchs, because of our love of it, it's kind of one of our first introductions and one of the things that informs our scientific literacy. It's one of the first lessons in our elementary classrooms where we start to learn about the life cycles of insects, and we get to see this metamorphosis unfold before our eyes. And that education continues as we get older. Here's a perfect example at the North Carolina Arboretum, where they made this awesome Lego monarch installation on one of its favorite host plants, the swamp milkweed there, with some interpretive signage talking about the life cycles and the host plant specificity. Monarchs are also fantastic for our green business. Just since 2016, when I started these projects, it's amazing how many more milkweeds, native plants, and nectar plants are available at the Lexington nursery centers. Lots of things are being promoted for being pollinator friendly. We're transitioning away from sort of the non-native ornamentals into some natives that can sort of fill those same roles. And because of all this, monarchs have become a conservation icon and a great entry point for people that are interested in conservation that want to help out. There's lots of programs out there that you can get involved with monarch health and conservation. Some like the Monarch Way Station programs, creating habitat. These tagging programs, you can help track the movement of butterflies throughout their migratory period. And also other ones you can help send in samples to figure out disease cycles and things like that. And because of all this, monarchs inspire an interest in nature for us. They're celebrated in festivals all across North America. They're the state insect of several different states, and they are just a beloved icon for conservation and for ecology in general. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to understand a little bit about the monarch butterfly to make sure the conservation choices we're making are going to be impactful and important. So here we see the basic butterfly life cycle from egg to hungry caterpillar to chrysalis to the adult. And here we see how the generations break out. Like we mentioned, they wake up in about March. They make their way to the southern US, lay their first generation, and then throughout the year, they'll move all the way up. And somewhere right around the September, October area is when that final generation is going to move back south. Now for Kentucky, July and August are going to be our biggest monarch populations throughout the year, because that's when the reproductive population is going to be present in Kentucky. And there's a lot of great places where you can see a lot of milkweed and interact with these butterflies. Monarchs are, of course, host plant specialists. They only use milkweed and very closely related species to lay their eggs on and rear their young. Here we see the three most recognizable milkweeds in the Kentucky area: the common milkweed, the swamp milkweed, and the butterfly milkweed. But of course, no plant wants to be chomped to death by little caterpillars. So milkweed has all sorts of different defenses that it has created in this sort of evolutionary arms race with creatures like the monarch butterfly who want to eat it. One such defense is this latex that they create. If anyone's ever broken open a leaf of milkweed, they've seen this sticky sap pour out. And it's also, with being sticky and viscous, it also has a brew of these toxic cardinaloids in it, which affect the health of the creatures eating it. As far as the physical defense, really early on, if a monarch takes a bite out of one of these leaves, that latex can gum up their mouth parts, stop their feeding, and lead to desiccation. And they also have to learn to deal with those cardinaloids in there. But of course, for every defense put up by the milkweed, the monarchs find a way around it. When monarchs first begin to feed, they'll hatch out of their eggs. They'll feed on their actual egg casing as their first meal, the very nutritious meal. And then the little caterpillars will actually cut a trench in a circle pattern in the leaf. It'll stop that flow of latex and they can freely feed on the leaf inside. As they get bigger, they'll just go ahead and just sever the entire vein of the leaf itself, stopping that positive pressure that forces the latex out of the plant, and then they can freely feed on the leaf after that. At some point during their evolution, monarchs picked up a gut microbe that helps them digest and deal and sequester these plant chemicals inside the milkweed, which they will then intake, and then they'll sort of diffuse them into the fatty tissues of their body and then store those and use them for their own defense. This, of course, leads to a lot of really interesting stories of mimicry in the monarch realm, what we call aposematic coloring or warning coloration, telling predators, hey, I don't taste good, please don't eat me. Here we see three butterflies that all look very similar: the monarch, the viceroy, and the queen butterfly. And then if you look at the caterpillars, there is definitely one that stands out. So both the monarch and the queen are very similar looking, whereas the viceroy is very cryptic and almost looks like a bird dropping. And that's because it's feeding on a different host plant that doesn't have the same sort of chemical makeup as the milkweed. It's actually feeding on black willow or species like that. So we're talking about monarchs because they are declining, and we want to ensure that we're not going to lose this amazing migration phenomenon. We know they're declining because every year they estimate the numbers of butterflies that show up at the overwintering sites, which will then be repopulating the US throughout the year. You can kind of see, it's a little bit hard to see, but this sort of orange area filling up about a third of the screen here is all forest and entirely clad in monarch butterflies. And just keep this in mind for the slides coming up. Look just how close agriculture and logging is getting to these overwintering sites. Now, they use the same about 13 sites every year. So if they lose those sites, there could be big problems for monarchs in the future. So here's what that decline has looked like over the past 25 years. This is measured in hectares, which is about 2.5 acres. And we're basically measuring how many hectares are occupied by monarchs throughout the year, which gets us a sort of basic population estimate. You can see there's natural fluctuations throughout the year. This could be because of disease or weather events. These sort of cycles happen, prey and predator cycles moving back and forth. But it's this 2013 and 2014 winter season that was the most alarming, where we only had about 0.67 hectares of occupied space in the overwintering grounds. Now, what we want to reach is this 6 mark. The 6 mark is what we estimate is going to be the level that we need to have a sustainable population from year to year. You can see in this 18-19 season, we actually hit that 6, but then the 19-20 season, we're back at about 2.5. So we still got some work to do. So why are monarchs declining? Like I alluded to a minute ago, loss of the overwintering grounds is going to be one of them. There's been logging that's been happening in those. They are protected now, but once again, the agriculture and logging is pretty close to these sites. There's still logs being poached out of these areas, and then climate change is also going to change the relationship and elevation with some of these sites. And then the other is the loss of the billions of stems of milkweed and flowering plant to support both the reproduction and the migration of the monarch butterfly. Oh, we've got our first intruder of the day. I'm gonna throw them out. So essentially, one of these problems here is what they call these Roundup ready crops, where they're essentially equipped to be resistant against herbicides. Of course, all of the naturally occurring plants are not going to be resistant. So you see scenes like this, where it's just acres upon acres of monoculture cropping. Also, things that are affecting monarchs are going to be loss of habitat due to urbanization, loss of habitat due to the way that we manage our landscapes. Like I already mentioned, climate change is going to be influencing these sort of plant and insect interactions. It could change the ranges and native ranges of different milkweeds, which is going to influence monarchs, and of course, pesticide use and other dangers like that. So because of all this, a key strategy for conserving the monarch butterfly has been to replant as much milkweed as possible. It's estimated that about 1.8 billion stems of milkweed need to be added to the landscape to reach that 6-hectare mark and keep a sustainable population. So the most important thing that you can do to support monarch butterflies is to plant host plants and to plant flowering plants that are going to support them during migration. This has been coined the all hands on deck strategy because it's really calling in a lot of different stakeholder groups from all different land use sectors, as well as individuals and volunteers to help restore and milkweed for this effort. So this is being played out in a bunch of different areas. There's a lot of different programs on things like farm reserve lands that can be, you can get tax credits for converting them into monarch habitat. We're starting to look at roadsides and how we manage those and getting away from the spray and pray mentality into more managing for things that are going to be suitable for pollinators. We're looking at industrial right-of-ways as a source for putting monarch habitat. And of course, the urban and suburban gardens, which we'll be focusing on today. It's estimated that about 30% of the milkweed needed in that 1.8 billion stems can be introduced into urban gardens and residential areas and suburban areas. And what's great about that is that there's still milkweed remaining in the fringe areas and the rural areas. But if we can create networks of gardens throughout urban areas, we create connectivity in the landscape that has been lost, and we're restoring that connectivity, which is going to make it a lot better for our monarchs. So one such program to look at this is the Monarch Way Station program, which essentially what they do is they'll recognize your efforts for creating monarch habitat on their national registry. You can set up your own garden. You can send it in. You can get one of these cool signs that shows your commitment to monarch conservation and can sort of create opportunities for education and a dialogue with other interested parties. Another such program is the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge that stemmed directly from that 2013 and 2014 overwintering season. This is essentially a volunteer program, same sort of thing. You create habitat, you can be recognized in our national registry. And from 2015 to 2018, they already surpassed their million garden goal and have gotten gardens all across the US. So when you go to start your own Monarch Way Station, you might go online and look for some tips and tricks. And if you look at the official Monarch Way Station site, you see something like this. You want to have your garden in full sun. You want to have 2 or more milkweed species. You want to have nectar sources, and you want to put your plants close together. Now, this is going to be pretty vague, and I think we can do a little bit better. So the first study I'm going to be talking about is looking at the configuration and location of gardens and how that influences and affects monarch colonization. Now, I did not put this slide up here to toot my own horn, but just to give you an idea of just how incredible in how attractive this species is. This is the Journal of Frontiers of Ecology and Evolution, and this was published in, December of 2019. And just in that short time, it is in the top 3% of any paper ever published in the journal, and it's had over 20,000 reviews, which is pretty incredible for being a pretty broad journal like this. So with this study, what we wanted to know, are monarchs actually using small gardens? If so, what characteristics of these gardens are promoting that use? And is there anything we can do to improve our small garden approach to monarch conservation? So the first thing I did was look at pre-existing monarch way stations that were created by citizen scientists like yourself. I identified 22 that had a sort of similar mix of different plants and milkweeds. They had to have milkweeds and flowering plants. I monitored all of these gardens twice a month from May to September. And while I was at the gardens, I was looking for the caterpillars, the eggs, and the butterflies, as well as taking an inventory of the botanical composition, the size, the location of these gardens, whether or not they had any sort of design implemented in them, and then what was going on in the surrounding landscape that would either enhance or detract from a monarch finding these gardens. So some of these gardens were very structured and more formal aesthetic, where everything was sort of separated from one another with plant spacing and set off by mulch. Some of these gardens were not structured at all and was in more of this plant competition strategy, which gives you sort of this sort of feral prairie aesthetic. Some of the gardens had a lot of hardscape and urban pressures around them with a lot of concrete and buildings, fast moving traffic, whereas others were in more open and serene areas. So just to take a look at one of these gardens, this one here is at Wellington Park. And the first thing we did was look at the characteristics of the garden themselves. We'll look at how many milkweeds are there, what kinds of milkweeds, how many nectar plants were available, this overall size of the garden, and then whether or not they employed that plant spacing strategy or they employed the plant competition strategy. After that, we wanted to look at the surrounding characteristics. And what we were thinking about when we did this is a 100-meter buffer zone surrounding the center of the garden here. And the way I was thinking about this is, what's the likelihood of a monarch flying in from 100 meters away, being able to orient to the garden and find it and use it for the way that it's intended to be? So we want to look at the amount of hardscape and impenetrable surfaces surrounding it, which we have all outlined here. We're going to look at the numbers of structures that may impede the garden itself, the proximity of those structures to the garden, and then whether or not the garden was accessible. So we'll look at another garden here to sort of visualize that. So first thing we want to know, does the garden have a clear line of sight to the north and south? If monarchs are using different cues and different, the internal compass that they use, that they're traveling and migrating north to south, it's likely that they're using the same sort of mechanics to travel throughout the breeding season. So it seems important that this north-south line may be open. And then we're looking at the accessibility. Essentially what we're creating is an accessibility indice, which it takes a 360-degree look at the garden, and we essentially cut out areas where if a monarch flies in, it's this building, this is going to impede its ability to orient to the garden. And the butterfly may hit the building here, simply go this way, maybe hit Richmond Road here, and then move on down. Whereas if there's a straight line, there's nothing going to impede that orientation to the garden. So here's a very complex and boring table here, just so you know that it exists and it's there, but instead of looking at that, we're just going to pull out all the fun stuff and look at that instead. So the first thing we found out was that yes, monarchs are using small gardens, and there are way more monarchs in these gardens than I ever expected them to be. And then out of all of the things we looked at, only two things came out to be statistically important for monarch habitats. The first of them, and the most important, being whether or not the gardens employed the structured plant spacing strategy or they employed the non-structured plant competition strategy. So we have our milkweeds and our other plants separated from one another. You're going to get a lot more monarchs inhabiting those gardens than if you have your milkweeds clustered or you have your milkweeds competing with other vegetation. Now, this is going to be a theme that's going to come up several times in this talk. And it's probably because monarchs are using visual cues to find and locate their host plants. So if you simplify the system, you increase their ability to find and colonize the milkweeds. The other thing that came out to be important was having a north-south line of sight open to the garden. When you have that open, you're much more likely to get monarch colonization than if you don't. Basically, what this means is that if you have the choice to plant your garden on the north or the south side of the house or the east and west side of the house, you may want to plant it on the east or west to maintain that north-south line of sight. But also you want to use the natural flyways and lines of your property to help influence the findability. Lastly, we noticed that isolated plants tended to have more eggs and larvae than plants that were in clusters. So we wanted to flush that out a little bit further. And to visualize that, this is kind of what we're thinking here, that a milkweed that is isolated is going to be a lot easier to find because it's going to have that strong visual cue and that silhouette. And it's also going to be accessible from head to toe, where a monarch can access the plant anywhere. Whereas milkweeds that are in competing vegetation, that strong visual silhouette is going to be decreased, as well as the availability of the milkweed that's usable. You can see maybe only the top third portion of this milkweed is actually going to be used by monarchs to lay eggs. So to look a little bit more at that, we went to the Lexington Arboretum, put out a bunch of different milkweeds, and some of them were left alone by themselves in manicured turf, whereas other ones were surrounded by ornamental grasses, not touching, but just enough to create a visual screen. So every day for 3 weeks, I would drag hundreds of yards of hose to water all of these plants so they wouldn't die in the August heat. And I would count the numbers of eggs on all the plants, removing the eggs each day. And what we found throughout that study was that, once again, those isolated plants are going to get a lot more statistical eggs than the plants that were screened by the ornamental grasses. So next, we have all this information we learned about these pre-existing gardens, and we wanted to put that to use in our own garden designs. Sometimes I've kind of seen two different kinds of gardens when I was doing this survey. Some of them seem to be more designed towards butterflies, others more designed towards humans. Here are two examples. The top is kind of this more prairie type aesthetic, lots of milkweeds, open area. Whereas the bottom one, although cleverly shaped like a butterfly, they've surrounded it with highly manicured things like boxwoods that are essentially creating a visual screen around the plants that they're wanting the butterflies to interact with in the center. But of course, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There's also some other things known out there about other butterflies, as well as their interactions with plants. So the first such story that I looked into was the story about the long-winged butterflies and their host plant, the passion flower. So this plant is known to use the shape of the leaf as a visual cue to find its host plant. Of course, once again, no plant wants to be chomped to death by hungry caterpillars. So what we see here is 3 species of passion flower, and all of these black silhouettes are all of the different leaf morphologies that single species is able to create, thus confusing the butterfly throughout the season as it goes from an oval teardrop shape to a star type shape, making it harder for the butterfly to find the leaf. What's even stranger than that is that if a butterfly encounters a leaf that already has an egg on it, it will not deposit an egg because it will likely not survive. So what does the passion flower start doing? It starts creating egg mimics on its leaf to further confuse the butterfly and make it harder for them to lay their eggs. Another example is with the pipevine swallowtail and their host plant, Aristolochia. Once again, they showed that the butterfly is using visual cues, especially leaf shape, to find its host plant. And after they figured that out, they did another study where they found natural existing Aristolochia And they either left it as is or removed all of the competing vegetation, simplifying the system. And they compared numbers of eggs and caterpillars that they found. Well, of course, when they simplified the system and they removed all that competing vegetation, they found a lot more eggs and caterpillars on these plants because they're a lot easier for the butterflies to find. There's been a lot of work on this sort of topic also in sustainable agriculture. One such tactic is this polyculture agriculture, where essentially what they do is they create this mosaic of unrelated plants, put them in close proximity. So then if a specialist herbivore comes in, they may perceive their host plant, but they may accidentally land on a non-host plant or an unrelated plant. They'll be confused, they'll leave the area, and it will lead to less pressure from specialist herbivores. When we're talking about monarchs, we want just the opposite. We want to make it as easy as possible for monarchs to find and use our gardens the way we intended them to. So we want to simplify those systems to increase colonization and make it as easy as possible for these butterflies to find their host plants. So here are the 3 gardens that I came up with using these theories and ideas and the things I've learned in the way stations that I had surveyed. First of them being is to put all of my milkweed on the outside of the garden, creating a perimeter of milkweed that I then set off by mulch and also separated far enough that they weren't interacting with other plants. In the center, I put in all of our nectar plants, all of our ornamental grasses and other things that are going to be important for our garden. And then I used the exact same number of plants in all 3 garden designs. The second design, I essentially created a wall that would act as both a visual and chemical barrier to the milkweed inside, because there's a bunch of these tall flowers, things like Tithonia torches and tall zinnias that are creating about a 5-6 foot barrier surrounding it. They're exuding a bunch of nectar and floral scents, which is going to mask the milkweed inside. And then the milkweed is on the inside, once again, sit off by mulch and separated accordingly. In the last design, we sort of simulated that more naturalized planting or that plant competition strategy, where we essentially took all of the milkweeds and nectar plants and ornamental plants, cut this into 4 grids, and then randomly just threw them in there wherever possible, creating this more complex sort of mosaic sort of look. So after I got these gardens established, I monitored them twice a month for 2 years. At every visit, I would count all of the eggs and all the caterpillars on the plant. I'd also note any predators that were on the plant, things like spiders or beetles or wasps or other things that could be interacting with monarch larvae. I also deploy what we call pitfall traps, which gives us an idea of the predators that are moving around on the ground, mainly things like predatory beetles, ants, and spiders, to see if there's any influence for garden design on the predators interacting with the gardens. And for all these gardens, we set up 5 replicates or 15 gardens. We did this all on the north side of Lexington at our big research campus. And I put all of these gardens on a 300-meter transect oriented east and west to hopefully capture that north-south flight, but then not have the gardens necessarily interact with one another on an east-west. So what we found was pretty awesome. So here we've got a couple series of graphs, one from 2017, one from 2018. The y-axis here, we've got the numbers of eggs and larvae, the means, and then we have our 3 garden designs on the bottom. So we have our first design with the perimeter milkweed in orange, the interior milkweed in blue, and then the mixed gardens in green. In the first year, we found 2.5 times more monarchs in our gardens with the perimeter milkweeds than we did the other 2 garden designs, which behaved very similar to one another. In the second year, we actually found 4 times more monarchs in the gardens with the perimeter milkweed than we did the interior or the mixed gardens. So to ensure that what was happening with our monarch colonization was due to garden design and not something else like the predators attracted to the gardens, we also looked at the predators. So don't get too bogged down with this sort of complex graph. Essentially just look at the 3 colors and sort of the wave-like motions of the bars. So once again, the orange is the perimeter gardens, the blue is the interior, and the green is the mixed. As you can see, they're all very similar, none of them being too far statistically different from one another, telling us that the garden design is influencing colonization and not something else like the predators that are being attracted to the gardens. There's a quick summary of this study. Yes, monarchs are using smaller than we'd ever expected. Plant spacing is going to promote colonization. And when I say spacing, I don't mean hundreds of yards. I mean 3 feet away, away from plants so they're not touching other plants.
Adam, we
That's your
lost,
ability.
oh, there you are again. Sorry,
Okay.
we lost connection for a minute again.
And then we also found that these isolated plants are going to be preferred. If you want to increase colonization, put some of your milkweeds in the perimeter of the garden or the exterior of the garden. And this just shows that we can use ecological theory and life history of the organisms we're trying to conserve to inform our designs and our conservation practices. So next we're going to move on to what types of milkweeds we should be using in the garden. There's about 100 species of milkweed available or native to North America. And every year the market for milkweed expands tremendously. A lot more different selections are available, cultivated varieties, non-native varieties. And we want to know what we should be using, and should we be using native plants, should we not? So in this study, we looked at 8 different species of milkweed, and we had a few questions that we wanted to figure out here. Essentially, what we wanted to know is, are all of these species equally attractive to the egg-laying mothers that are going to come in and colonize our gardens? Are all of them equally suitable as a food source for the caterpillars? We wanted to know how they were going to behave in the garden setting, whether or not they're going to be big and brutish and move into your neighbor's yard and give them a monarch way station whether they want one or not, or if they're going to stay in place and sort of adhere to your designs. And then beyond that, we also wanted to look at the bee communities on each of the milkweeds so we can support those other pollinators as well. So here are the 8 species of milkweed that we looked at. Top left, we've got the orange butterfly milkweed, the tuberosa, the common milkweed, or syriaca, the swamp milkweed, or incarnata. Here we've got a more western species, the narrow-leaf milkweed. Here we've got the green milkweed, the viridis. Got another western species, the broadleaf milkweed, latifolia. The world milkweed, verticillata. And then another, basically the common milkweed counterpart for the West, the showy milkweed, or speciosa. As you can see, these are all in the same genus. They're all milkweeds, but they all are very different. They have different size flowers, different colors, different leaf shapes, different heights. Very, very diverse group, even being in the same genus. So to look at this, we went to the Lexington Arboretum. We created 6 gardens with all 8 species of these milkweeds laid out similar to the picture you see below. We did 24 plants per garden, 4 of each species, and then monitored all of these gardens twice a month for 2 years to see how the monarchs were interacting. To look at the host plant suitability or the nutritional value of the milkweeds, I would take out larvae and put them on the plants and then enclose them in these little white mesh bags. I'd allow them to feed, and then I'd take them out and gauge how much weight they had gained, as well as how many developmental stages they had made it through. The monarchs have 5 developmental stages, and the faster they grow, the better, because as a caterpillar, they're kind of this fat, squishy baby that can't see very well and is prone to a lot of predation. So growing fast is advantageous for insects, and getting through those developmental stages is going to help them reach adulthood sooner. And then to look at the suitability, we also counted the numbers of ramets created. So each of these milkweeds started off with 1 stem in each hole. At the end of the 2 years, we want to know how many more stems have created out of those and how many have escaped out of the garden. Here we see what that kind of looks like, where someone has created a common milkweed patch here, but then through this rhizomal spreading, we see the milkweed invading the lawn here and being into the turf area where it's being mowed off. So what we found was pretty interesting as far as which type of milkweed the monarch likes best. So throughout the 2 years, in the first year, what we found was that these 3 species, the swamp, the showy, and the common milkweed, were all the most attractive to get the most eggs and caterpillars to the garden. Now, these are also the 3 tallest species, which plays back into that visual cue sort of hypothesis here, where the taller and more visually apparent they are, the more likely they are to receive eggs. So here we see in the first year, the swamp milkweed was the most attractive, followed by the showy and then the common. In the first year, all 3 of these species maxed out at about 3.5 feet. In the second year, however, the relationship changes. So in the second year, the swamp milkweed maxes out at 3.5 feet once again, but the showy and the common milkweed are hitting about 5 feet, 5.5 feet. And then that relationship changes. In year 2, the showy is the most attractive, followed by the common and then the swamp milkweed. But all in all 3 of these species are going to be very good for attracting eggs and caterpillars to the garden. As far as the growth and development of the caterpillars was concerned, instead of showing you a bunch of bar graphs with equally sized bars, I'm just going to tell you what happened. Essentially, all 8 species were viable nutritionally for monarch caterpillars. We did not see any difference in the growth or the developmental rates between the species. So even though some are not being selected very much by the mothers to lay their eggs upon, they're still nutritionally viable for the monarchs. And then some of these species are going to spread aggressively. They're going to spread underground through rhizomes, whereas other species are only going to spread via seed, making them stay put and making them easier to sort of have them where you want them in the garden. Some are, well behaved. So things like the butterfly milkweed and the swamp milkweed are only going to be spreading via seed, which means they're very good selections for small gardens and backyard areas where you don't want them to spread. If you want them to spread, things like the common milkweed are going to be the choice for your area in Kentucky. The first couple years, they're going to be rather slow, but year 5, they will start spreading out and moving into areas, and they're great for filling in large areas. But of course, milkweed is not just for monarchs. We also want to support the bees in our area and support that diversity. So to do that, to look at these bee communities, what I did was made collections of bees off of all 8 species of milkweed. I collected 250 bees, 50 from each garden. And then how I did that was I would take butterfly nets, capture bees. I would store them in ethanol until I got them back to the lab, where I had this fantastic bee spa where I would shampoo and dry them and pin them and identify them to genus and species. As you can imagine, when you start swinging a net at crazy attractive milkweeds with bees all over them, they get quite agitated. So we did have to deploy some rather devious tactics to ensure that we could catch all of the bees that we needed. So once again, don't get bogged down with the particulars of this graphic, just mainly take in how many different colors are in the circles. As you can see with these 6 species of milkweed here that we're able to get full samples from, there's a lot going on. You can see sort of the swamp, the common, and maybe the butterfly all have a lot of red in there. It means there's a lot of bumblebees in there. Whereas like the speciosa has a lot of honeybees. And then the verticillata, you can see this is kind of the one that stands out, has a lot of different colors on it. So what we found was that if you're interested in supporting large bees like honeybees, bumblebees or carpenter bees, the common, the showy, and the swamp are all going to be perfect choices for you. They're going to have a larger flower form, which is going to facilitate interactions with larger bees. If you're more interested in the small native bees, the butterfly milkweed, which actually had the greatest number of bees out of any of the milkweeds, is going to be a great choice. And then the world milkweed, which didn't have a lot of visitations, but it actually had the greatest diversity out of any of the milkweed species for attracting bees. Here we even see a bumblebee that its mouth parts are too large to access the nectaries up top here. So what it's doing is going underneath the flower, cutting open the nectary and stealing the nectar from the bottom without offering any pollination services. So just a quick summary here. The tall broadleaf milkweeds are going to be the most attractive for recruiting monarchs to your garden. All 8 species were suitable nutritionally for monarchs. Some of the milkweeds are going to be tailored for small gardens, for formal designs, whereas others are going to be better at spreading. Bees love milkweed. It's a great nectar source. They have a very complicated pollination strategy, which means they're going to create lots of nectar so they get as much chances at that as possible. And then key take-home point here is put in multiple species of milkweed in your garden because they're going to be offering different services. And one thing that's great to do, I love the combination of the swamp milkweed and the butterfly milkweed, because early season, that swamp milkweed is going to get hammered with the caterpillars. But as that plant starts to die off, that butterfly milkweed that has not been used very much is still going to be in great condition. So the late season, that's going to become more attractive. Almost all the eggs and caterpillars that I found on the short statured milkweeds, like the butterfly milkweed, were found either really early or really late in the season. So lastly, we're going to touch on one other topic here, then we'll take some questions. And this is looking at this idea of native plants in the garden, and then whether or not we should be using cultivated varieties of plants or we should be using the straight native species. So cultivars are essentially plants that we recognize that are naturally occurring, that have an interesting phenology to them, either color, flower form, or things like that, and we'll selectively breed this particular plant so we can get that desired trait. This has a few concerns, one of them being, if that plant isn't particularly well co-adapted with the things like the monarchs that are eating it, there could be problems there. This also lowers the genetic diversity of the milkweeds in place if you're only using cultivars. And it also may influence the biodiversity able to use the different milkweeds. So in this study, we looked at 2 species of milkweed and then 3 of their cultivars each. We've got the swamp milkweed with its cultivar soulmate, which is selecting for more flower umbels. The ice ballet, which is selecting for a white flower form as well as a pale green leaf. And then the Cinderella, which is selecting for larger flower clusters. The next, we have the butterfly milkweed group. All 3 of their cultivars that I was able to get my hands on were selecting for different flower color. The Hello Yellow, which is a bright yellow. The Gay Butterflies, which has several different colors from red to orange to yellow. And then the Blonde Bombshell, which has a more of a creamy yellow color. So this study wanted to know, does cultivation influence those mother monarchs into laying their eggs? Does it confuse them? We wanted to know, once again, nutritionally, are all of these cultivars just as good as the wild type milkweeds? We wanted to look at the defensive characteristics, because sometimes when we select for specific traits in plants, we also influence other traits in plants that were unintended. And then we also wanted to look at the bee visitation, because if we're selecting for flower traits, there's a likelihood that there's going to be different relationships with the milkweeds. So here's actually one of our gardens that we had at the Arboretum right next to the Nature Center there. And here are all of my lab mates helping me find the monarchs on various types of milkweeds. So very similar to the last study we talked about, we created 6 replicated gardens with the 24 plants, 4 per type, established them, and then monitored them for 2 years for monarch activity. Once again, to check nutrition, we did the same sort of thing where we had caged the monarchs on the various types of milkweed and then measured the developmental rates as well as the amount of weight they're gained. And we also looked at the defensive characteristics of the plant. One of them being that latex exudation. If we cut the plant, how much latex is going to exude. Look at the numbers of trichomes on the bottoms of leaves, which are essentially little hairs that that make it difficult for small insects to move around the plant. And then we also looked at those defensive chemical characteristics from the cardinaloids and seeing whether or not some of these cultivars had greater or less cardinaloids than the wild types. So first and foremost, what we found is that mother monarchs really do not care if the milkweed is cultivated or not. They all recognized these milkweeds as being beneficial, and they were not confused when encountering them. Up top, we've got the swamp milkweed group. You can see the brown bar is 2018, the blue is 2019, and you can see there's really no differences, at least not substantial, between the overall colonization. As far as the tuberosa group was concerned, once again, we did not see any difference in colonization. I have the blonde bombshell circled here because it did not do well the second year, so we do not have data for that second year. So cultivation does not influence colonization, does not confuse mother butterflies coming in to lay eggs. When we looked at the overall growth and development, once again, like we found last time, we did not find any differences between the cultivars and their respective wild types. On the left, we've got the swamp milkweed group. You can see those bars pretty flat across as far as the amount of weight they gained, and as well as the instar or developmental stage achieved. As far as the butterfly group was concerned, we did see that the hello yellow wasn't quite as good as the other two, but not by a large margin. And as far as the defensive characteristics, this was pretty interesting. We have up top the swamp milkweed group with its wild type and its 3 cultivars, and then on the bottom we've got the butterfly milkweed group in its 3 cultivars. So as far as the latex was concerned, that's that sticky fluid that comes out, we found that one of the cultivars had statistically more latex than the wild type in the swamp group. And we found that 2 of the cultivars had more latex than the wild type in the butterfly milkweed group. As far as the trichomes were concerned, the ice ballet in the swamp milkweed group had a bit more trichomes than the wild type. Nothing else different there. And as far as the cardinaloids were concerned, once again, the ice ballet had greater cardinaloids than did the wild type. But as you can see, if you look at the difference in magnitude between the swamp group and the butterfly group, you can see we're going from 4 to 20 to 18 in this group, and we're going from 392 to 694 in this group. So any differences in cardinaloids in the swamp group are most certainly not going to influence the growth and development, because this milkweed in particular just has lower cardinaloids than some others. So what does this all mean? Well, even though we did observe differences in defensive characteristics, some of the cultivars expressing them a little bit more harshly than the wild types, we did not see any influence on growth and development, meaning that monarchs are pretty adaptable and pretty tough being able to overcome these defenses. So once again, we looked at all of the different bees that were on these various types of milkweeds with the same methods we used before. And once again, look at the overall color distribution of the graphs and not so much about the particulars. So here we have everything broken down by family up top. And when we break it down by the family resolution, you can see all 4 of these milkweeds look very similar in the swamp milkweed group. But when we break it down to the genus, we start to see some differences. The one standing out to me is this soulmate. And if you remember, the soulmate was selected for having more flower umbels, which creates a greater pollinator and nectar and pollen source. So this makes a lot of sense. The milkweed that's being selected for more flowers is attracting a greater diversity and greater number of bees. Here we see the butterfly milkweed group. Once again, up top, by family, we are seeing some differences. The blonde bombshell standing out here with this huge swath of orange. And when we break it down by genus, once again, we see that almost all the bees on that one blonde bombshell milkweed all came from one genus. But just take a look at this bottom row for a second here and just look at how many different colors are on this represented. and you compare that to the swamp milkweed group, and you can just see the amount of diversity that we get on the butterfly group compared to that swamp milkweed group. So here's what some of these collections look like. You can see some of them being pretty much entirely made up of large bees like the bumblebees, others, all these little tiny sweat bees. So a quick summary here is that cultivation did not influence colonization. All of the cultivars were suitable for monarch growth. The defensive characteristics were influenced to a certain degree, but not enough that they're going to have negative effects on monarchs. But some of the cultivars did in fact attract more bees and greater diversity than the milkweeds. Sort of the key take-home point here is that cultivars have the same ecological function and value as their native counterparts. And this is going to be great information because now we can sort of incorporate more choices in the garden, create more aesthetic appeal, but also still support monarch butterflies. I would also throw this in that I would never use just one cultivar of milkweed in the garden. Use different varieties, wild types, mix it up. You want to keep that genetic diversity intact. So don't worry, the end is in sight. Just a quick few points to wrap up what we talked about today. First is that if we put our milkweed on the perimeter of gardens, we set it off by mulch, we make it very apparent, we enhance its silhouette, we're going to increase colonization by monarchs. Plants that have, or gardens that have that north-south line of sight intact are going to be more attractive than gardens that are going to be without those lines of sight. For instance, there was one garden that I monitored that was at a nursing home, and they had a garden that was in inside a area of the building, a courtyard. And basically what would happen is the garden was here. There's 20-foot high walls surrounding the entire garden. So basically the only way a monarch butterfly could find or see that garden is if it flew directly over the top of the garden and then went inside. And throughout that, we found absolutely zero monarchs in that garden the entire time because they did not have the ability to orient to the garden and find it. For small gardens, things like the swamp, the butterfly, the world, and the green milkweed are all going to be great choices. The world does spread a little bit by rhizomes, but not very aggressively unless it's just in a prime location. If you want to fill in large areas, use something like the common milkweed. And then the key finding in the cultivar study, we didn't find really any differences between the relationship of the monarchs and the milkweed, but we did find differences in the relationships between the bee communities and the milkweed. So some of these cultivars are actually going to be more attractive to bees. So with that, I'd like to thank all the people that helped make this research possible, all the folks in my lab in the UK that helped me get this work done and out to the world. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if you all have any. Thank you so much for having me.